Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute for Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. All right, today we're sitting down with Bill Emmott. He's the chairman of the Trustees of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and former editor of The Economist. And we're going to talk about the upcoming election in the United Kingdom on July 4th, an auspicious date that I'd be remiss to point out as an American. And we're here to talk about the role of international economics in the UK and how that might be affected, how these issues might be affected if there is indeed a change of government. So, Bill Emmott, thanks for sitting down with us today.
A great pleasure to be here.
So, we'll start off with the very, basic scene-setting question. What's the political context? Why an election? Why now? What's the background to all of this?
I think the first political context that's important is that we got in the habit in the UK of having long periods of domination of government by one party. Mm-hmm. You had Margaret Thatcher and then John Major for 18 years. Mm-hmm. You then had Tony Blair, Gordon Brown for 11, 12 years. Mm-hmm. Now we've had 14 years of a conservative, so center-right mm-hmm. or right-wing led government. That's context one. Context two is that in that conservative 14 years, which you think was stable period, mm-hmm. we had the global financial crisis in 2008. Mm-hmm. That really shook up the British economy, shook up British politics, produced an increased level of insecurity, but also it generated competition on particularly from populist, mm-hmm. more right-wing groups against the Conservatives. And that then led to the Brexit referendum, the referendum to discuss leaving the European Union in 2016. Mm-hmm. And then that, in turn, the surprise decision to leave, from mm-hmm. many points of view, led to what I would describe as a kind of psychological nervous breakdown in the Conservative Party, by which I really mean political infighting. There wasn't a plan. Nobody had really thought through what to do. Mm-hmm. And now, in a very ideological way, they've been kind of scrapping with each other in a way untypical of that party in history, but that's their characteristic. So, fast forward to 2024, you've had this psychological nervous breakdown, plus the pandemic, which we should mm-hmm. not fail to mention as a hit to everyone.
Of course.
And so this government has been running out of gas, basically. And it anyway comes to an end of its mandate at the latest January 2025. Mm-hmm. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, decided to call the election early, mm-hmm. knowing that he was way behind in the opinion polls, but thought calling a surprise election might just be the one card he could play.
But it's not looking good for him in the polls. I think I saw this morning a lot of the different consulting places give Labour about a 90% chance of winning. Is that consistent with your expectations? Absolutely.
I think the polls have been very stable for more than a year, probably 2 years more or less, number one. Number two, it used to be in the British electoral system that because of the way the constituency boundaries had evolved with population change, there was a disadvantage to the Labour Party. That is still somewhat true. But on the other hand, in the current situation, two things are helping them. One is the disintegration of the Conservative Party and new competition from a right-wing party, which is likely to split the Conservative vote. Mm-hmm. In our first past the post, winner-takes-all electoral system, mm-hmm. that will likely lose them many more seats than otherwise. And secondly, Scotland, yes. important part of the UK, that had been a Labour stronghold, then took over by the pro-independence mm-hmm. Scottish National Party, mm-hmm. drove out most of the Labour MPs. The SNP is now itself collapsing, yes. with the result that very likely Labour will be able to win back quite a large number of the Scottish seats. Mm-hmm. So the wins are definitely behind Labour as we go into this election. And indeed, the speculation is this going to be an almost total wipeout for the Conservatives? Kim Campbell's Conservative Party in Canada holds the record for going from power to almost disappearance in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Now, some of the speculation is, are we going to have a second Kim Campbell phenomenon? Now, there's 4 or 5 weeks to go.
Right,
It's
of course.
too soon to say that, but nevertheless, that's the prospect that the Conservatives are facing.
So turning back to the experience of conservative government for the past 14 years, you highlighted they were in power during some really decisive moments in recent global economic history, the financial crisis, the pandemic, Brexit, obviously, and then amidst all of that, the apparent rise of right-wing populism, maybe as a reaction to that, maybe something else, but whatever. How did they react to that? What was their strategy amidst all this? I mean, you talked about the political infighting, but amidst all of that infighting, what were the Conservative Party's priorities in the international economy? How did they respond to these kinds of challenges and try to manage them and try to recover the UK?
I'd say the early strategy, in other words, 2010 when they were elected, just after the global financial crisis, the early strategy was like classic fiscally conservative, prudent government.
Right.
So British public debt had risen. There was a risk of a collapse or a big fall of the price of the value of the pound. In a classic Conservative Party way, they went for an austere fiscal policy,
right.
belt tightening and so forth, which had domestic ramifications of cutting public services of various kinds and constraining, also slowing down the recovery probably, but from an international point of view, had a positive effect because it stabilized the view of the British pound, of British debt in international markets, and probably contributed among everyone else's initiatives to kind of stabilizing the international part of the global financial crisis. So it was a classic policy, but it produced domestic consequences in terms of inequality and discontent that ended up, among other things, leading to Brexit.
Okay.
So, and Brexit, of course, is an act of international economic policy.
Right,
Plus an act of constitutional policy, but it is an act of international economic policy.
And it was also sort of a conservative policy as well, right?
Well, those most strongly in favor of Brexit were on the right wing. Now, so why were they in favor of it, and to what degree was it conservative is a fair question. They were in favor of it, one, on anti-immigration grounds, because membership of the European Union meant that we have free movement of people, of labor, across the whole 500 million membership of the EU, and secondly, on sovereignty grounds. So, hence that laws and policies were being made collectively in Brussels rather than in Westminster in London.
The loss of control and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, on the other side, what's unconservative about it is that it involves raising trade barriers against your nearest and most fundamental economic partners.
Right.
So, by definition, almost whatever your policy is, if you withdraw, you are then erecting a new trade barrier against a market which you would have previously had friction-free trade. So that was sort of against the trend of free market, open trade conservatism. And one has to remember, in the British international economic context, one of the architects of the so-called single market program in the European Union, friction-free trade across commerce across the European Union, was Margaret Thatcher.
Yes.
Together with Jacques Delors, the rather more left-wing European Commission president. But this was a Thatcher policy that, in effect, was being repudiated by her heirs in the Conservative Party.
So what changed? Was this a more assertive right wing? Was it a bad experience with liberalized trade? I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast on Brexit, so I don't want to spend too much time on Brexit in particular and its history, but I am curious, what changed? Because this is something that you see all over, I mean, particularly in the United States right now.
I think what changed was really the global financial crisis, which produced obviously a destabilizing shock in an economy that had become very dependent on financial services, and international financial services in particular, which produced a rise in inequality and a sense of insecurity, which then coincided with or interacted with a fairly high rate of immigration flows. And that cocktail produced like the right-wing populism kind of formula. Aside from the question of free financial flows, in other words, free flows of capital, international economics really didn't. I mean, maybe I shouldn't make that an exception. That's a pretty big thing.
Right,
but certainly it wasn't about trade.
Right.
It wasn't about goods and other services.
Right.
It was all about finance and financial flows. But really, free movement of people was then at the political part of it that produced the competition from the right. Then there came an idea that, oh, wait a minute, sovereignty could mean, in some of their eyes, that Britain could become again a global kind of open trading power outside the framework, the straitjacket as they saw it, of the European Union. And the European Union at the time had been going through its own difficult times, thanks to
they had their own crisis.
They had their own financial,
all this.
exactly, the sovereign debt crisis of the euro and all of that. And then the crisis of immigration, particularly across the Mediterranean, from Syria and from Libya and all those places. So that model wasn't looking too good.
Right. The
idea that, well, setting ourselves free could open new doors, and maybe we could be, an ultra free trading power. The phrase that we used to get bandied around was we could become a Singapore on Thames, which possibly means that not many of those who used it had been to Singapore.
I was just about to say, but okay, let's go with the analogy for their sake.
It meant an open kind of an entrepreneurial economy connected to the world. Of course,
sounds nice.
Sounds nice. Maybe they hadn't focused on the Singapore's level of regulation inside, nor the role of the public sector in all sorts of aspects of the economy. But that said, the open trading point resonated.
Okay.
However, with Brexit is, as we've already said, with regard to the largest trading partner, 60% of Britain's trade, thanks to geographical proximity, is with other members of the European Union. So by definition, you're raising a barrier against them.
Yes.
So the open trading idea has to justify it, has to say, well, the reduction in barriers with the rest of the world, compared with what we already had as a member of the European Union, would have to compensate for that. And that's a tough call. So
that might lead us into wrap up the conversation about the Tories' international economic strategy, because one of their accomplishments, and we're sitting in Tokyo right now, would be their signing of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Absolutely.
So does that happen without Brexit?
It could not have happened without Brexit.
How?
Because if you're a member of the European Union, trade policy is delegated to the European Union. So individual countries cannot make their own trade policy. They can make commercial deals, of course, but they could not have signed. Only the European Union could have signed and applied to be a member of the CPTPP. So it is absolutely true that is something that is enabled by Brexit. The big question is what's the economic benefit versus the political benefit?
Right.
And my view is that the political benefit is way higher than the economic benefit.
So in that light, does this... Well, let me back up. How about you unpack that? Why do you say the political benefit outweighs the economic benefit?
Because I think Britain already had free trade agreements with most of the larger countries of the CPTPP.
Right.
Thanks to the EU, it had a pretty good deal with Japan, or at least joining the CPTPP has not improved that deal materially. So in terms of reduction of costs of trade, the consequences of membership of the CPTPP are either close to zero or quite small. And it's a faraway part of the world, albeit obviously a large and important part of the world, but it is a faraway part of the world. So it economically is useful, but not game-changing. I think is the way to look at it. Would be, it is constructive. Politically, sitting down next to Japan in a rule-setting body with great political significance in the Indo-Pacific is very positive for the UK, but also, I hope, positive for Japan, for like standing shoulder to shoulder in defending free trading values, defending rules, setting the rules, is definitely a positive thing.
So before we go to what might change, I'm curious what kind of continuity there is in British international economic strategy. Do interests really change? Does approach, does strategy, do preferences change when you go government to government, leader to leader? Or are things generally pretty consistent?
I'd say in the past, by which I mean from Thatcher to Blair and Blair to Cameron, the answer to that question would be there's more continuity than change internationally. Whereas the real changes that happen are domestic.
Right.
Those domestic changes have an international ramification, of course, but principally it's that. Now, because of Brexit, that's no longer as true because the Conservative government made its particular deals with the European Union as in its withdrawal, its divorce agreement, if you will, and I would say one of the major things that at least we expect from a Labour government is a renegotiation and a rethinking of that divorce agreement in order to reduce the barriers to international trade.
So not rejoining the EU,
not rejoining
a EU, well, not EU-ish, but something that might give you some of the benefits, but not all of the obligations. Perhaps?
That's right. Now, in our continent, this is thought of as either the Norway model or the Switzerland model. So these two countries are not members of the European Union, but they have arrangements with the European Union which give them many of the benefits in terms of free movement of commerce. And Britain is likely to try to move back to a situation more analogous to Norway and Switzerland.
I see.
So that's the main change versus the past sort of continuity, I would say. Otherwise, in terms of kind of fiscal policy and its implications for financial flows, I'd say there's going to be more continuity. Change. We're an open economy that depends on the kindness of strangers. In terms of our international borrowing, with a current account deficit, you have to do that. That framing reality is the same for whichever party is in power. Relationships with the United States, well, a big hope among those who were advocates of Brexit was that they would do a new trade deal with the United States. Now that failed because of the politics of trade in the United States. Those politics are not going to change after the next election, regardless of who wins.
Nope. As an Americanist, I can say they will almost certainly not change.
They will not change, or if they do change, they will get worse.
Fair point.
So in other words, from a new Labour government point of view, there is not an opportunity to do something different with this obviously the major market of the US. Nor, though, and this is back to continuity, will there be a desire to do anything different with China. So the other major international economic security type question is, would they be any different in their dealings with China? And I think not. I think that there's a bipartisan kind of consensus about what has to be done with regard to trade with China, and it's not a dominant part of British policy or politics in the way that it is in Washington or perhaps in a certain sense in Tokyo.
And some European countries for that matter.
But nevertheless, insofar as it is talked about, there's a consensus, pretty clear, I think.
So talk about the Labour Party for a little bit. I mean, who are they these days? What are their priorities? Are they an echo of Tony Blair's third way approach of the 90s? Are they closer to what they would have been in the 70s or even farther back? Who are they? What do they want? What are their priorities? Have they taken their own progressive turn the way the right wing sort of influenced the Conservative Party during their time in power. Talk to us about them a little bit.
I'd say the closest and past analogy would be the Tony Blair years.
Okay.
However, as they enter office in 2024, they will be looking at a scene where, for them, inequality, in particular regional inequality, but also just general socioeconomic...
Regional within the UK.
Within the UK, and socioeconomic inequality is a more severe problem than it was in 1997 when Tony Blair took over. And therefore, I think while they are essentially Blairite and third way-ish in their way of thinking, their emphasis is likely to be on that inequality question. Plus, of course, the environment. So I think if the sort of people who are at the top of the Labour Party are more or less the Tony Blair type people, with a few exceptions, but they've moved back from the more progressive, more left-wing position that they had 4 or 5 years ago. But their competition politically is from the environmentalists, from the Green Party, which means that they're going to need to put quite an emphasis on the green transition and all of that. But then their long-term issue is about regional inequality and social income inequality. So more than in the early Blair years, they're likely to be looking at redistributive policies, probably using both the tax system and spending, than was the case in that early Blair years.
So what about in terms of their approach to international economic questions? We've touched on Brexit a little bit and what they might do, but do they have to, I mean, I'm sorry to keep going back to the United States, but I can't help it. Do labor leaders have to reconcile a progressive wing, a trade skeptical wing, the way that the Biden administration has had to in the United States, or do they have a little bit more freedom to act on these questions?
I'd say they have more freedom to act. They certainly don't have a trade skeptic wing. So they're free of that. They do have a progressive wing. So there'll be elements within the party that will say, you really should be doing more on the inequality issue. You should be doing more on like identity issues as well. All to do with equal rights of various kinds, and the green and the environmentalists. So they will be a pull, but trade skepticism not. So therefore, there's less international issues about this.
Interesting.
And I think that
why is that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's a good, fair question. I'm not sure what the kind of profound answer to that is. I'd say. Maybe it was the heritage of being in the European Union for 40 years, just kind of neutralized the issue of trade as far as the left was concerned. 40 years ago, when I was growing up and a student and so forth, there was the people who were anti-European Union were on the left. Why? Because they thought that the European Union was a tool of multinational capitalism that was going to distort and destroy the socialist dream in the UK. So it was that kind of trade skeptic, but also capitalism skeptic type of progressives. That really has gone on the left. I mean, that's not entirely, but pretty much.
Interesting.
I think so. Now, a question about the outcome of this election is that if you get a very large majority, that then will make the Labour government dominant in Parliament, but will make the party harder to manage, to discipline.
A bigger tent.
A much bigger tent.
More cats to herd.
A lot more cats to herd. A lot of people who have been elected who you didn't expect to be elected. And you may try to work out who they are if you're the leader. But also, for those individual members of Parliament, the weapon of you've got to be in line or else we all fall together falls away. If you have a huge majority, you can decide actually to make my name. I'm going to have my topic and my rebellion and my campaign, and that could be a bit destabilizing in these sorts of progressive directions in particular.
Okay, so Final question, do you want to make a prediction? I mean, I think, we already talked about the betting houses or the consultancies predicting 90% labor. So let's make it a little more challenging. How big of a majority do you think labor? Will this be a coalition government, absolute majority, sweeping majority?
I think it'll be a sweeping majority. I think I'd say 99.9% certain that they will have an absolute majority.
Absolute majority.
Absolute,
okay.
Yeah, definitely. A lower percentage probability that it's an enormous sweeping majority.
Okay.
But the comparison we tend to use in the UK is it bigger or smaller than Tony Blair's pretty large majority in 1997?
That's the benchmark,
That's kind of our internal benchmark. And it looks pretty likely it'll be a bit larger.
Really?
Yeah, just because of these dynamics that are going on in the vote. Now, so a few weeks to go, but still it looks pretty likely that it'll be pretty large.
Interesting.
So that has the consequence I've just described. The second consequence is for the Conservative Party, much smaller, and then where they go afterwards will be an interesting question, including on these international economic issues, free trade versus kind of more sovereignty, protectionist, anti-immigrant sort of way. Yeah.
Well, this will certainly give us something to pay attention to in the coming months. So, Bill Emmott, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great.
It's been a great pleasure.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, think of the Silk Road and you probably imagine lines of camel trains sneaking through deserts, passing the turquoise domes of long-forgotten cities, and carrying the luxuries of the time, silks, precious stones, valuable metals, and asbestos. Okay, most people probably don't think of asbestos when they think of the Silk Road. Most people, when they think about asbestos, probably remember asbestos-wrapped pipes or home insulation that's now largely banned from use for its deadly, cancer-causing dust. They almost definitely don't associate it with the luxuries of Silk Road trade. But its fire-resistant properties have made it a desired material almost since the Stone Age. It was used to strengthen ceramic pots, as a funeral shroud for ancient kings, and was described by Pliny the Elder as being more valuable than pearls. A party trick among wealthy Persians was to clean an asbestos cloth by exposing it to fire, and they explained that asbestos was the fur of the salamander, which itself was supposed to be immune to fire. As an aside, I know that salamanders don't have fur and they are not immune to fire, be that as it may. Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, was supposed to have had an asbestos tablecloth in his palace, while medieval knights had it added to their armor to increase its strength. It even, and much later, gave its name to the town of Asbestos, Quebec. Now called Val-des-Sauces, the town once had the world's largest asbestos mine in the 1800s, and it, along with the nearby town of Thetford Mines, supplied global demand for asbestos during the Industrial Revolution, where it was used for insulation, yarn making, drywall, outdoor furniture, and more. The expanded use of the material led to greater awareness of its health risks, and asbestos was eventually banned over the course of the 20th century. But getting back to the Silk Road, asbestos fibers were harvested from places like India, Evia Island in Greece, and the Alps, and it turned up among consumers all along the Silk Road, Egypt, China, Greece, Russia, and everywhere in between. And its practical applications gave it a place along with the more famous luxury goods in the camel trains that traveled the Silk Road. Those consumers just hadn't figured out the health risks yet. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@iehj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.